Chapter 18. March on Washington. Within the next few years, Mother became accepted as an industrial engineer, and motion study began to play an increasingly important part in the mass production of the 20s. The fight had been uphill, but many of Dad's former clients, and a good many new clients, finally had conceded that Mother knew her business and had hired her firm as a consultant. The family finances, while not in a state of great prosperity, were immeasurably improved. Mother still rode in buses and upper berths, but she was able to start paying off her debts and to make a dent in the mortgage on the house. Mother's goal of sending all of us through college now seemed more than a possibility. Martha was enrolled at a New Jersey State College for Women, and Frank at the University of Michigan. That meant there was only Bill, Lillian, Fred, Dan, Jack, Bob, and Jane to usher into the halls of higher learning. Mother was sure it was going to be a breeze. While Mother's nose was healing, she had started writing The Homemaker in her job, published in 1927. Living with Our Children was published the following year. She continued to teach her motion study course, served on the New Jersey State Board of Regents, and was a delegate to the World Power Congress in Tokyo. She also became a Girl Scout. Mrs. Herbert Hoover was responsible for Mother's original interest in scouting. Mother had known the Hoovers for a good many years, socially since they were fellow Californians, and professionally since Mr. Hoover was an engineer. After Mr. Hoover was inaugurated president, Mother sometimes visited them in Washington and at their fishing camp on the Rapidan River. Mr. Hoover appointed her to his National Advisory Committee on Employment, and Mrs. Hoover, who was a national president of the Girl Scouts, wanted her to head up the personal division of that organization. Mother wasn't sure she could spare the time, but Mrs. Hoover invited her to a tea at which a delegation of ladies in uniform were present. In a surprise ceremony, Mrs. Hoover announced she wanted to take Mother into the Girl Scouts right then and there. With the other ladies' smiling encouragement, Mother arose to recite the oath. None of us girls had been scouts, but Frank and Bill had both joined the Boy Scouts some years before. Mother had helped them memorize their oaths and pass the tenderfoot tests. Standing in the White House, she raised 3 fingers of her right hand. Mrs. Hoover nodded reassuringly. It was a solemn moment, and Mother started to recite. On my honor, I will do my best to do my duty to God and my country always. To... The lady snickered. That's fine, Mrs. Hoover smiled when Mother had finished. This means you're a full-fledged Boy Scout. Now, would you like to join the Girl Scouts? Mother said she would. Girl Scouts try, said Mrs. Hoover. Their oath starts like this. On my honor, I will try to do my duty. Mother raised 3 fingers again and swore to try. Later on, she even got a uniform. When our older girls teased her about it and kept asking her to give her Girl Scouts honor every time she would make a flat statement of fact, she threatened to buy a khaki shirt and trousers and a camping hat. I can always switch to the other branch if you don't like this uniform, she'd say. I took both oaths, you know. On one of Mother's visits with the Hoovers, the president urged her to bring all of us to a formal afternoon reception at the White House. The affair was to be held within a few days, and for the Cabinet, Supreme Court, and the Diplomatic Corps. I'd like to meet all the Gilbreth children, the president said cordially. Mother was grateful for the invitation, but she knew we didn't like to appear en masse at anything. Besides, she had visions of railroad tickets and new outfits for everybody. They'd all love to come, she said, but I'm afraid they'd strain the seams of even the White House. Nonsense, said Mr. Hoover. We'd love to have them. Suppose, said Mother, who thought a compromise was in order, I just bring the 6 boys. The boys will be fine, Mr. Hoover agreed hospitably. Why don't you telephone them right now? Come on here. I won't take no for an answer. A phone was thrust into Mother's hand, and she put a call into Montclair. Frank, who was home from the University of Michigan on holiday, answered the ring. I have great news, Mother said, while the Hoovers beamed. The president has been kind enough to invite all you boys to a reception at the White House. She put her hand over the mouthpiece and turned to the Hoovers. I can just see their faces, can't you? For crying out loud, Frank groaned. Can you see if you can get us out of it, Mother? I can't, said Mother. I tried, but I can't. I can't believe it's true either. I don't want to bring all the kids down there, Frank complained. Besides, I've got a date for almost every night of my vacation. You'll have to break it, dear. You'll have to break the news gently so the other boys won't take the roof off the house when they hear the glad tidings. The Hoovers are right here. Just think of that. Good night, said Frank, only much quieter. I'm sorry. We're trapped then, huh? You certainly are, said Mother. We all are. It's not something that happens every day. Mother told Frank she had business in Washington and would not be able to return to Montclair to supervise the boys' preparations. They were to wear their best suits and, of course, white shirts and black shoes. If they all took an early morning train from Newark, they'd get to Washington about lunchtime. Mother would be waiting for them at her hotel, and they could come to her room and wash up before the reception. Bill, who was now a senior in high school and currently in charge of the checking account, withdrew enough cash from the bank to oversee the cost of 3 full and 3 half tickets to Washington and return. It seemed like a lot of money, and both Bill and Frank thought it would be cheaper to make the trip by car. They felt sure that once they had arrived in Washington and had explained to Mother about the savings, she would approve too. The 2 older boys and Martha were in the possessors of a Model T touring car. The vehicle was an antique when they acquired it the year before for $20, and it had aged perceptibly under its new ownership. The car had neither top nor fenders. The body was painted airplane silver. A 6-inch red stripe, none too expertly applied, ran waterline fashion around the whole, at a point equidistant from the running boards and the top of the doors. Starting the motor was a 2-man proposition, with one person turning the crank and jiggling a wire loop choke which protruded from the front of the radiator, and the other sitting in the driver's seat to retard the spark as soon as the engine coughed. But the 3 owners had done a good deal of work on the motor. It was reliable and purred like a kitten, only louder. There was no doubt in anyone's mind the car could make the trip to the capital. As a matter of insurance, though, a tire pump, tire patches, spare spark coils, and miscellaneous tools were stowed under the seats, and the boys decided to start the journey before dawn. The day before departure, Frank held a dress rehearsal to make sure the delegation had the proper clothes. All of the boys, with the exception of Frank, owned blue serge suits. Frank had handed down his blue serge to Bill that autumn and replaced it with a collegiate number purchased at the campus toggery shop in Ann Arbor. The suit had padded shoulders, wasp waist, 23-inch cuffs on the trousers, and a double-breasted vest with lapels. The color was something between tan and yellow, without many of the best features of either. The material was as heavy and hairy as an army blanket. It had cost $28, and Frank was immensely pleased with it. From the consistency of the cloth, it was apparent that the suit would wear forever. It was this aspect that appealed least to the other boys when Frank appeared at dress rehearsal. "Good Lord, what's that?" Bill whined when Frank walked into the parlor. "I hope you didn't throw away the sales slip. Take it off quick before you muss it up." "What's the matter with it?" Frank asked with hurt feelings. "If it's going to be a party like Halloween," said Bob, who was 9, "can I wear my cowboy suit?" Bill felt the material. "It's your own business what you buy when you get something thin that you can wear out yourself," he complained. "But when you pick out a heavy suit like that, you're supposed to have me with you." "For something as heavy as that, he's supposed to take all of us with him," Fred added. "That one will go all the way down the line to Bob." "What's the matter with your kid's taste?" Frank marveled. "How far behind the time is this town anyway? This color is the latest thing at Michigan." "It looks," said Bob, "like what happens to the mustard jar when you forgot to screw the top back on." "It does not," Frank told him, "and you keep out of this. It just happens I've had a lot of compliments on it at Michigan." "You mean you've worn it before?" asked Bill, deflated. "Then you can't take it back." "I wore it all fall. How come I didn't see it in your closet after you unpacked?" "Because I know you," Frank said. "That's why. Every time I get a new suit, the first thing I know you're borrowing it and splitting things on it." "If he spilled mustard," Bob insisted, "you won't have to worry about it once it dried." "It sheds, too," Bill said accusingly, picking Nap off the sleeve of his blue serge where it had been brushed against Frank. "You're going to have to leave yellow hairs all over Mr. Hoover." "I don't intend to be brushing up against anybody," Frank replied. "It sheds a little, I'll admit that. It's because it's still comparatively new." "Don't think I'm going to walk through the reception line with you," Bill warned. I'm not going to watch cabinet officers and the diplomatic corps tiptoeing through great piles of nap that you've deposited all the way from the south portico to the blue room. Do you think all the nap will be gone by the time it's handed down to me? Bob asked. I doubt it, Bill replied. I promise you one thing, I'll never help get rid of any of it. There were 2 flat tires between Montclair and Philadelphia, but the boys patched them and the car ran well. Frank tried to make up some of the time they had lost in fixing the tires. And shortly before they reached Baltimore, a motorcycle patrolman came up behind them and waved them down for speeding. I congratulate you for bringing that heap all the way from New Jersey, he said, copying the license number into his ticket book. If I didn't see it with my own eyes, I'd never believe you could get 60 miles an hour out of it. We can do 70 on the hills, Bob volunteered proudly. Frank and Bill did something to make the engine run faster. Shut up, Bill whispered, leaning forward and beaning Bob with his knuckles. Do you want us to get sent up the river? Sent up the river? Jack sneered. They can't do that to us. We don't take nothing from nobody, understand? Nothing from nobody. Bill beamed him too. 70, huh? Said the policeman, making note of it. He looked at the patched, treadless tires and shook his head. What are you trying to do, buddy? Kill all the kids? At that point, Frank thought killing them was a pretty sensible suggestion. But he shook his head, gulped, and wondered how Mother would explain to the Hoovers her sons could not attend the reception on account of being sent up the river. Where do you think you're going anyway? The policeman asked, thrusting his face up near Frank's. We're going to the Washington, officer. And what are you going to do in Washington? Frank thought the one over and concluded if he knew what was good for him, he better come up with a more convincing explanation than the truth. Why, nothing in particular, he said. Just a sightsee, I guess. Go ahead and tell him, Jack said contemptuously. Don't let him buffalo you like that. Bill beamed him again. Yeah, tell me, the policeman ordered. All right, said Frank. We're going to see President Hoover. I love wise guys, particularly in suits like that one, the patrolman leered. I suppose the president invited you personally to drop in and have tea with him at the White House. Sure he did. Frank nodded sheepishly. Nothing from nobody, Jack repeated from the back seat, putting his hands over his head to stave off Bill's knuckles. That's right, honest, said Frank desperately. We've had some flat tires and now we're late. You, said the policeman, pointing to Jack, is that right? Are you going to see the president? Not just the president, Jack told him. Mrs. Hoover and some judges from the Supreme Court, too. Why don't you shove off, buddy? The patrolman surveyed the car, the airplane paint job, the red water line. He looked at us individually. Frank, Bill, and Fred, greasy from changing tires. Dan, pale and about to get car sick. Jack and Bob, wrinkled and dirty. I guess you're telling the truth, he said. The president doesn't get many laughs, and I ain't going to be responsible for his missing this one. Go ahead, but not more than 40 miles an hour. The weather had been fair when the boys left Montclair, but it was cloudy in Baltimore, and between Baltimore and Washington it started to rain. The boys were wet through by the time Frank pulled up in front of Mother's hotel. Even the Joad family had never received a more wrathful reception from a doorman. He won't let the boys alight until Frank promised to park the car down the street, a block away from his hotel. Mother was sitting in an armchair, reading and knitting, when the boys entered her room. She changed clothes and was ready for the reception. Oh my, she said. It's my fault, Mother, Frank told her. I thought it would be cheaper and easier to drive. I don't mean that, said Mother. Come here, Dan. You're pale as a sheet. You don't feel well at all, do you? Dan explained that he had been car sick, but now he felt all right, that he was on firm land again. You had me worried for a while, she smiled, kissing the boys. You mean you drove here all the way from Montclair on that gray thing? Wouldn't Mr. Lindbergh be jealous? Frank said he was sorry that because they were wet they wouldn't be able to go to the reception, but Mother said that they had to go and that she thought she could dry them out on time. Everyone will look fine once they're dry, she added, except, what's the matter with your suit, Frank? Did the rain fade it? That's the way it looks all the time, Bill said resentfully. There's nothing the matter with it, Frank pouted. It's the latest thing. Mother said she was sure of it. It was. She stripped her bed and gave each of the boys a sheet or blanket. Then they went into the bathroom, took off their clothes, and sat around in bedwear while they waited for their turns to get baths. Mother called the desk and made arrangements for an iron and ironing board to be sent up to her room, and for the boys' shoes to be taken down to the boiler room to dry. Why, yes, she added as an apparent afterthought, and send up a newspaper too, if you will. And after the board had been set up, Mother started pressing the boys' underwear, socks, shirts, and suits until they were dry. She saved Frank's suit until last. When she had finished with his coat and vest, and was in the middle of his pants, she stopped long enough to phone the desk again and ask that the shoes be returned. A musty odor of burned dye and scorched wool permeated the room. "Hey!" shouted Frank. "My pants!" Mother put down the phone quickly and ran to the board. "Now look what I have done," she reproached herself. "I have burned a hole right through your beautiful trousers." "Hot dog!" Fred gloated. "Ruined!" Frank choked. "I'll never be able to match them." "Well, there's no argument there," Bill said. "I don't know how I could have been so stupid," she complained, looking at her watch. "We still have 15 minutes, though. We'll pick up a new suit for you. I'll take along a needle and thread and hem the cuffs so they'll do for the time being." "Do you think we can find one with the heavy kind of material?" Frank asked. "I hope we can. Say, it's lucky I had them send up newspaper. Look through it and see if they have anything on sale." "Wait a minute," said Frank accusingly. "That business of ordering a newspaper. Are you sure that was just luck? You didn't burn those pants on purpose, did you?" "For goodness sake," Mother laughed. "Do you think I'd like to buy you boys new clothes? Do you think I'm naturally destructive?" The shoes arrived from the boiler room. With Frank self-consciously holding down his coat to hide a wedge-shaped hole in his trousers, Mother and the boys walked to a department store that had advertised clothing sale. Frank found a suit of heavy material, not unlike his old one, except that it was conservatively cut in dark blue instead of yellow tan. Even Bill admitted it was handsome. The coat and vest fitted well enough, and Mother basted in the cuffs. They stopped at a barber shop for a shoe shine, and then hailed a cab. "To the White House, please," Mother said. She looked as cool and unruffled as if she had when the boys first arrived at her hotel. The boys were on their especially good behavior as they waited to go through the receiving line. But when Bill saw an immensely dignified, bearded figure, he whispered excitedly to Mother, "Say, isn't that Charles Evans Hughes?" The Chief Justice had heard his name and turned toward Bill and bowed formally from the waist. "Good afternoon, sir," he said. "And madam." If that was the way you behaved at the White House, the boys weren't going to be outdone. All 6 of them bowed from the waist and said, "Good afternoon, sir." The President and Mrs. Hoover were cordial and hospitable. "They look as if they've just stepped out of a bandbox," said Mrs. Hoover. "I never thought young boys could look that pressed." She turned to Frank. "You're the oldest, aren't you?" Frank said he was, madam. "Then I guess you're the one who looked after everybody on the trip down. I guess you're the one I really ought to be complimenting about stepping out of a bandbox." Frank said, "Thank you, madam." The boys bowed from the waist and moved along the receiving line. Mother had planned to return home by train that afternoon. Although she had always before avoided the Model T, she allowed herself to be talked into making the return trip in the car. The skies had cleared and the weather was mild. Frank held the Ford at a dignified 45 and there was no tire trouble. They stopped at Baltimore for supper, and when they emerged from the restaurant, the stars were out, and it was still and peaceful. "Why, this isn't bad at all," Mother sighed contentedly. "I ought to let you boys drive me on all my trips." They started to sing some of the songs Mother had taught them when they were younger. Old Black Joe, Clementine, "Backward, turn backward, O time in thy flight." Half an hour out of Baltimore, a siren sounded, and a motorcycle policeman pulled up alongside. "How was tea at the White House?" The officer hollered over the roar of 2 exhausts. "Fine," Frank shouted back. "How's the kid who was sick?" "I'm fine," Dan assured him. "And the one who don't take nothing from nobody." "Okay," Jack grinned. The policeman gunned his motorcycle up the highway. "Good gracious," Mother marveled. "I don't know how you boys do it." They asked her what she meant. "The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court bows to you. The President and his wife hold up a receiving line to chat with you. And you make friends with policemen all the way from Montclair to Washington. I'm certainly lucky to have such fine sons." The boys had the good grace to think there was a slight possibility that Mother might be prejudiced.